The wind cut across the ridgeline like a blade, carrying with it the smell of dust and dying crops. Thomas Verne stood at the edge of his property, one boot pressed against the lowest rail of a fence that had seen better decades, and squinted into the pale afternoon sun. The wood beneath his hands was cracked and grey, held together more by stubbornness than by nails. Much like himself, he thought. 52 years old, widower, farmer on a planet nobody remembered. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm and looked out over the fields. Rows of kethwheat stretched toward the horizon, their stalks thin and struggling. The soil here was poor, always had been, but it was his. Every metre of it had been paid for with years of labour, with Helen's laughter before the sickness took her, with the dream that maybe, just maybe, they could make something grow where others had given up. That dream felt hollow now. Thomas pulled a rusted hammer from his belt and crouched beside a fence post that had come loose. The wood was rotting at the base. He should replace it entirely, but replacement posts cost credits he didn't have. So he did what he always did. He drove the nail back in, deeper this time, and hoped it would hold another season. Behind him, the small cabin sat alone against the hillside, its roof patched with mismatched sheets of metal. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Inside, a pot of thin stew simmered on the stove. It would be his dinner, his breakfast, and probably his lunch tomorrow. He'd learned to stretch meals the way he stretched everything else. A low hum broke the silence. Thomas turned and watched as a cargo hauler drifted overhead, its thrusters kicking up dust as it angled toward the colony port 10 kilometers west. The ship was kale-built, sleek and efficient, the kind of vessel that moved goods between systems without a second thought. He watched it disappear beyond the hills, carrying shipments of grain, metals, synthesized goods, things that mattered to people who mattered, not from his farm, of course. Nobody bought from Thomas Verne anymore. The last merchant who'd stopped by had been polite enough, but the message was clear. His yields were too small, his prices not competitive, and frankly, there were automated agricultural platforms that did the job better. The man had smiled, shaken Thomas's hand, and flown off in a ship that cost more than Thomas would see in 10 lifetimes. He drove another nail, then another. The fence groaned, but held. Thomas stood and rolled his shoulders, feeling the ache settle into his lower back. His hands were calloused and scarred, the knuckles swollen from years of work. He looked down at them, these hands that had built a life, buried a wife, and kept a dying farm alive through sheer refusal to quit. Stubborn old fool, he muttered to himself. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong. Thomas froze. It was faint, distant, a sharp, high-pitched cry that cut through the air like broken glass. He turned toward the forest that bordered the eastern edge of his land, the place the colonists called the Blackwood Thicket. It was a tangle of twisted trees and thorned undergrowth, home to scavengers and worse. No one went in there, not if they had sense. The cry came again, louder this time, desperate. Thomas's heart kicked hard against his ribs. He knew that sound. He'd heard it once before, years ago, when a colonist's child had wandered too far and the claw beasts had caught the scent. By the time they'd found the kid, there hadn't been much left to bury. He looked back at his cabin, then at the forest. "Walk away," a voice in his head said. "It's not your problem. You're one man with a bum knee and a farming blade. Whatever's out there, it's already dead." The cry split the air again, raw, terrified, and unmistakably young. Damn it! Thomas grabbed the machete leaning against the fence post, its edge dull but serviceable, and broke into a run. His knee protested immediately, a hot lance of pain shooting up his thigh, but he ignored it. He crashed through the low brush at the forest's edge, branches snapping against his face and arms. The undergrowth thickened fast, clawing at his pants, but he pushed forward, following the sound. The screaming grew louder. Then he heard the snarling. Thomas burst into a small clearing and stopped cold. 3 claw beasts circled a figure huddled against the base of a massive tree. The creatures were low to the ground, each one the size of a large dog, with matted black fur and mouths full of teeth that curved backward like fishhooks. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the shadows. One of them lunged forward, snapping, and the figure screamed again, a child's voice, thin and broken. Thomas didn't think. He ran forward, yelling at the top of his lungs, and swung the machete in a wide arc. The blade caught the nearest claw beast across the shoulder, and the creature yelped, stumbling sideways. The other 2 turned toward him, lips peeling back in wet snarls. "Come on!" Thomas roared, his voice cracking. "Come on, you ugly bastards! The first claw beast lunged. Thomas sidestepped and brought the machete down hard, catching it across the spine. The creature collapsed with a wet, choking sound. The second one leaped, claws outstretched, and Thomas barely got his arm up in time. The beast's claws raked across his forearm, tearing through his sleeve and into flesh. He shouted in pain and slammed the pommel of the machete into the creature's skull. It dropped, twitching. The third claw beast hesitated, eyes flicking between Thomas and the child. Then it turned and bolted into the undergrowth, disappearing into the shadows. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm. His hands were shaking. He looked down at the two dead claw beasts, then at the machete still clenched in his grip. "Jesus," he breathed. A soft whimper brought his attention back to the tree. The child was still there, pressed against the bark, knees drawn up to their chest. Thomas took a slow step forward, machete lowering. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse. "Hey, it's okay. They're gone." The child didn't move. Thomas crouched down, wincing as his knee buckled, and got his first clear look. It wasn't a human child. The girl, he thought it was a girl, was small, maybe 8 or 9 years old by human standards, but her skin was a pale, luminous blue, like the color of a winter sky just before dawn. Her hair was white, almost silver, and fell in tangled waves around her face. Her eyes were enormous, almond-shaped, and glowed a soft, molten gold. She wore clothes that had once been fine, some kind of tunic with intricate embroidery, but they were torn and filthy now, stained with dirt and blood. And on her shoulder, just visible through a tear in the fabric, was a symbol. A stylized sunburst, etched in gold thread. Thomas didn't recognize it, but he knew expensive when he saw it. "You're not from around here, are you?" he said quietly. The girl stared at him, her golden eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't speak, didn't move. Thomas set the machete down slowly and held up his hands, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I promise. But you're hurt and those things might come back. You need help." The girl's gaze flicked to his bleeding arm, then back to his face. Her lips moved and she said something in a language Thomas didn't understand. Soft, melodic, but edged with fear. "I don't know what you're saying," Thomas said, "but if you stay here, you're going to die. So how about you come with me and we figure the rest out later?" He extended his hand. The girl stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her small, cold hand in his. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's get you out of here." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. She was shivering, her legs unsteady. Thomas picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, and started back through the forest, cradling her against his chest. The girl buried her face in his shoulder and said nothing. By the time Thomas reached the cabin, the sun was sinking below the hills, painting the sky in shades of rust and amber. He kicked the door open and carried the girl inside, setting her down carefully on the worn couch near the fire. She curled into herself immediately, her golden eyes tracking his every movement. Thomas grabbed a clean cloth from the kitchen and soaked it in warm water from the kettle. He crouched beside her, moving slowly, and began wiping the dirt and blood from her face. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you're safe." The girl watched him with those strange, glowing eyes, and for the first time she didn't look quite so afraid. Thomas wrapped a blanket around her and sat back, exhausted. His arm throbbed where the claw beast had clawed him, but he'd deal with that later. Right now, he just needed to make sure this kid didn't go into shock. Outside, the wind howled across the empty fields, and somewhere in the darkness, something watched the cabin with interest. Thomas woke to the sound of silence. It was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling beams of his cabin, listening. No wind, no creaking wood, no distant animal calls from the blackwood thicket. Then he remembered the girl. He sat up fast, ignoring the protest from his lower back, and looked toward the couch. The blanket he'd wrapped around her was still there, bunched up in a heap, but the girl was gone. Damn it! Thomas threw off his own blanket and swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. His arm throbbed where the claw beast had torn into him the day before. He'd wrapped it in clean cloth, but it needed proper stitching. That could wait. He scanned the small cabin quickly. The front door was still latched from the inside. The window shutters were closed. She was still here, somewhere. He found her in the kitchen, The girl was standing on a wooden stool, reaching up toward the top shelf where Thomas kept his spare flour and dried beans. She was still wearing the tattered tunic from yesterday, and his jacket hung loose around her shoulders, far too big for her small frame. Her white hair was a tangled mess, and her golden eyes were fixed on a tin container just out of reach. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "Hungry?" The girl spun around so fast she nearly fell off the stool. Thomas stepped forward, hands out, but she caught herself, gripping the counter's edge. She stared at him, her eyes wide, and said something in that same melodic language he didn't understand. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "I don't know what you're saying," Thomas said slowly, keeping his tone calm. "But if you're looking for food, I can help with that." He gestured toward the table, then toward his mouth, miming eating. The girl watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she climbed down from the stool and stood there, arms wrapped around herself. Thomas moved past her, careful not to get too close, and pulled down the tin she'd been reaching for. He opened it and scooped out a handful of dried oats, then poured them into a pot on the stove. He added water from the pitcher, a pinch of salt, and a precious spoonful of honey he'd been saving. As the mixture began to heat, the smell of warm porridge filled the cabin. The girl's nose twitched. She took a small step closer. Thomas ladled the porridge into 2 bowls and set them on the table. He sat down at one side and nudged the other bowl toward the empty chair across from him. "Go on," he said. "It's not much, but it'll keep you going." The girl hesitated, her gaze flicking between Thomas and the steaming bowl. Then she moved forward, slow and cautious, and climbed into the chair. She picked up the spoon, clumsily, as if she wasn't used to holding one, and dipped it into the porridge. She brought it to her lips, blew on it softly, and took a bite. Her eyes widened. Thomas watched as she took another bite, then another, faster now. She ate like someone who hadn't had a real meal in days. He didn't say anything, just ate his own breakfast and let her finish. When her bowl was empty, she set the spoon down carefully and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Thomas blinked. The words were accented, halting but unmistakably in the common galactic trade language, the pigeon tongue used across most of the outer systems. He hadn't expected her to know it. "You're welcome," he said. "You speak trade?" The girl nodded slowly. "Little. I learn before." She struggled with the words, her brow furrowing. "Not good." "It's good enough," Thomas said. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. She looked down at her hands, and for a moment, Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said very quietly, "Lirae, Lirae," Thomas repeated. "That's a good name. I'm Thomas." "Thomas," she said, trying the syllables out. She looked up at him, and for the first time something like a smile flickered across her face. "Close enough," Thomas said. He glanced at the torn tunic she was wearing, at the dirt still smudged on her arms. "You need to get cleaned up. There's a wash basin out back, and I've got some old clothes that might fit if we roll up the sleeves. Sound good?" Lirae nodded. Thomas stood and led her outside, into the morning light. The sky was clear, the sun already climbing over the hills. He filled the wash basin with water from the pump and handed her a bar of soap and a clean rag. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be inside if you need anything." He left her there and went back into the cabin, giving her privacy. While he waited, he busied himself with cleaning up the breakfast dishes and checking the bandage on his arm. The clawbeast's claws had gone deep, and the wound was red and angry-looking, but it didn't seem infected. Not yet, anyway. When Lirae came back inside, she looked almost like a different person. Her face was clean, her hair still damp and clinging to her neck. She was wearing one of Thomas's old work shirts, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and a pair of canvas pants cinched tight with a length of rope. She looked absurd, drowning in fabric, but her eyes were brighter. "Better?" Thomas asked. Lirae nodded. "Better." For the next few days they settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Thomas worked the farm during the day, mending fences, tending the struggling kethwheat, hauling water from the well. Lirae followed him everywhere, silent as a shadow. She didn't speak much, but she watched everything he did with an intensity that was almost unnerving. When he hammered a loose board back into place, she picked up a nail and studied it. When he poured seed into the planter, she crouched beside him and touched the dirt with her fingertips. At night, they ate together at the small table. Thomas shared what little he had: porridge, bread, the occasional bit of dried meat. Lirae never complained. She ate everything he gave her and always said thank you in her halting trade tongue. She didn't talk about where she came from. Thomas didn't push. On the third night, Thomas was sitting outside on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Lirae came out and sat beside him, her legs dangling off the edge of the wooden platform. She was wearing the oversized shirt again, and she'd wrapped the blanket around her shoulders like a cloak. "Stars," she said softly, pointing up. "Yeah," Thomas said, "a lot of them." Lirae was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My home, far." Thomas glanced at her. "You remember your home?" She nodded slowly. "Big, many people, loud." She struggled to find the words. "Not like here." "Busy, you mean?" "Yes, busy." She looked down at her hands. "I lost. They look, I think." "Someone's looking for you?" Lirae hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe. I don't know." Thomas leaned back against the porch railing, thinking. The girl had clearly come from money, those clothes, that symbol on her shoulder. Somebody important had lost a kid, and if they were looking, they'd turn the whole sector upside down to find her. But nobody had come to his farm. No ships, no soldiers, no desperate parents. Either they didn't know where to look, or they'd already given up. "Well," Thomas said finally, "until someone shows up, you're safe here." "Okay?" Lirae looked at him, her golden eyes reflecting the starlight. "You kind," she said. "Why?" Thomas shrugged. "Because you needed help. That's reason enough." Lirae stared at him for a long time, as if trying to understand something she'd never encountered before. Then she leaned against his shoulder, just slightly, and said nothing. They sat there together, watching the stars wheel overhead, and for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel quite so alone. The next morning, Thomas woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, heart pounding, and looked around wildly. The cabin wasn't on fire, the smoke was coming from outside. He threw on his boots and rushed out the door, and stopped dead. Lirae was standing in the middle of the yard, one hand outstretched, and a small flame was dancing in her palm. Thomas stared. The flame wasn't natural. It didn't flicker like fire should. It was a perfect sphere of golden light, hovering just above her skin, casting long shadows across the ground. Lirae was watching it with intense concentration, her brow furrowed, her lips moving in a silent whisper. "Lirae," Thomas said carefully, "what are you doing?" The flame vanished instantly. Lirae spun around, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't—" "Hey, it's okay," Thomas said, holding up his hands. "I'm not mad, just surprised." He stepped closer. "Can you do that again?" Lirae looked uncertain. Then slowly she held out her hand. The golden flame appeared again, small and steady. She closed her fist, and it disappeared. Thomas let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. You're a sparker." "Sparker?" Lirae repeated, confused. "Someone who can manipulate energy," Thomas explained. "It's rare, real rare. I've only heard about it." He crouched down to her level. "Where I come from, that kind of thing is usually genetic. You born with it?" Lirae nodded slowly. "My family. We all have." She struggled with the words. "Gift, old gift." Thomas studied her face, the symbol on her shoulder, the way she carried herself, even in his oversized clothes. The pieces were starting to fit together, and he didn't like the picture they made. "Your family," he said quietly. "They important people?" Lirae looked down. "Yes." "How important?" She didn't answer. Thomas stood and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right, we'll deal with that when we have to. For now, just maybe don't set anything on fire, okay?" Lirae nodded quickly. "Okay, good. Now come on. I've got fences to fix and you can help me carry the tools." She followed him across the yard, and as they worked together in the morning sun, Thomas tried not to think about what kind of family would let a child with that much power wander into a forest full of clawbeasts. But the thought wouldn't leave him. 2 weeks passed. Thomas learned that Lirae was curious about everything. She followed him through every task, studying the way he coaxed life from stubborn soil, repaired broken tools with wire and patience, and rationed food like a man who knew hunger intimately. She helped where she could, carrying buckets, holding boards steady while he hammered, sweeping the cabin floor with a broom nearly as tall as she was. She rarely spoke, but her golden eyes absorbed everything. At night she would sit at the table and draw. Thomas had given her an old ledger book he'd used years ago to track crop yields, its pages mostly blank now. She filled them with symbols, complex geometric patterns, flowing script in a language Thomas didn't recognize, and occasionally sketches of places that looked nothing like his farm, towering spires that pierced clouds, ships that dwarfed mountains, crowds of figures in elaborate clothing. Thomas never asked about the drawings. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. On the 15th day, everything changed. Thomas was in the north field, bent over a row of keth wheat that had been choked out by ground vine. The invasive plant had wrapped itself around the stalks like strangling fingers, and he was cutting it away carefully, trying to save what he could. Lirae sat nearby on an overturned bucket, her bare feet swinging, watching him work. "Why you stay here?" she asked suddenly. Thomas paused, his knife hovering over a tangled section of vine. "What do you mean?" "This place," Lirae said, gesturing at the struggling crops, the dry hills, the cabin in the distance. "Hard. You work hard. But no money, no people." She tilted her head. "Why not go?" Thomas sat back on his heels and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Where would I go? Big cities, other planets, places with more. More what?" "Everything." Thomas looked out across his fields at the thin rows of keth wheat bending in the wind. "This was my wife's dream," he said quietly. "Helen. She believed we could make something here even when nobody else did. We bought this land together, cleared it together, planted the first seeds together." He dug his fingers into the dirt. "When she got sick, I promised her I'd keep it going. So that's what I do." Lirae was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "She was lucky." "Lucky how?" "To have you." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He cleared his throat and went back to cutting vines. "Yeah, well, I was the lucky one." They worked in silence after that, the sun climbing higher until Lirae suddenly stiffened. "What is it?" Thomas asked. She was staring at the sky, her expression frozen. "Ship," she whispered. Thomas followed her gaze and saw nothing at first. Then he heard it, a low, thrumming hum that vibrated in his bones. The sound grew louder, and a shadow fell across the field. A ship descended from the clouds. But this wasn't like the cargo haulers that occasionally passed overhead. This was something else entirely. The vessel was massive, easily 300 meters long, its hull a gleaming silver that caught the sunlight like a mirror. The design was elegant, almost organic, with sweeping curves and wings that looked more decorative than functional. Glowing symbols pulsed along its sides, the same sunburst pattern Thomas had seen on Lirae's shoulder. "Oh no," Lirae whispered. The ship came to a stop directly above Thomas's farm, hovering in mid-air with perfect stillness. Then a ramp extended from its belly, and figures began descending. There were 6 of them, all wearing armor that looked like liquid metal poured over their bodies. They moved with military precision, weapons held ready, sleek rifles that hummed with barely contained energy. Their faces were hidden behind angular helmets, but Thomas could see their builds. They weren't human. The lead figure stopped 10 meters from Thomas and Lirae. The helmet retracted with a soft hiss, and Thomas got his first clear look at an alien soldier. The being was tall, at least 7 feet, with smooth grey skin and sharp angular features. Its eyes were a deep violet, and when it spoke, its voice was cold and clipped. "Step away from the child." Thomas didn't move. He placed himself between the soldier and Lirae. "Who are you?" "That is not your concern," the soldier said. "You are harboring the heir to the Sunari dynasty. Step aside, human, or you will be removed." Thomas's heart was hammering, but he kept his voice steady. "She's a kid. She was hurt. I helped her." "Your service is noted," the soldier said, though there was no gratitude in the words. "Now step aside." Behind Thomas, Lirae's hand found his. Her grip was trembling. "Thomas," she whispered, "it's okay. I have to go." "You don't have to do anything," Thomas said, not taking his eyes off the soldier. The soldier's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. The other 5 soldiers spread out, surrounding them in a loose semicircle. "This is your final warning, human. The child is under the protection of the Imperial Guard. Interference will be met with lethal force." Thomas felt Lirae tug on his hand. He looked down at her, and she shook her head slightly. Her golden eyes were filled with resignation. "It's okay," she said again. "They're right. I have to go home." Thomas crouched down so he was at her level. "You sure?" She nodded, but her hand tightened around his. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything." "You don't owe me anything, kid." Lirae let go of his hand and walked toward the soldiers. They closed ranks around her immediately, their weapons never lowering. The lead soldier glanced at Thomas one last time, then turned and began leading the group back toward the ship. Lirae stopped at the base of the ramp and looked back. Thomas raised his hand in a small wave. She didn't wave back. She just stared at him, memorizing his face, and then she turned and disappeared into the ship. The ramp retracted. The engines thrummed louder, and then the ship lifted into the sky, climbing fast, until it was nothing more than a silver speck against the clouds. Thomas stood there in the middle of his field alone and watched until it was gone. That night, Thomas sat on the porch with a bottle of cheap whiskey he'd been saving for no particular reason. He poured himself a glass, drank it, and poured another. The stars were out, cold and distant, and the wind carried the smell of dust. He thought about Lirae's drawings, still sitting on the table inside. He thought about the way she'd said, "Thank you," as if those two words could cover what had happened between them. He thought about the soldiers, their weapons, the way they'd treated him like an insect that had accidentally wandered into something important. "Heir to the Sunari dynasty," he muttered. Hell of a thing. He drank until the bottle was empty, until the stars blurred together, and then he went inside and fell asleep on the couch. In the morning, he woke with a headache and an empty cabin. Thomas didn't talk about the girl after that. When the few colonists who still lived nearby asked if he'd seen the imperial ship, he shrugged and said he didn't know what they were talking about. When a merchant stopped by a week later and mentioned that there'd been rumors of a royal child going missing, Thomas just grunted and said he didn't follow the news. Life went back to what it had been before. He worked the fields. He fixed the fences. He ate alone. The cabin felt bigger somehow and quieter. 2 months passed, then 3, then a year. Thomas stopped counting after that. The farm continued to struggle. The crops were thin, the soil unforgiving. The corporate conglomerate that owned half the planet sent him a notice that his land taxes were overdue. He ignored it. They sent another. He ignored that one too. Eventually, a representative showed up at his door. A Vex with scales the color of polished brass and eyes like black marbles. "Mr. Verne," the Vex said, its voice smooth and condescending, "you are 6 months behind on your payments. If you cannot settle your debt within 30 days, we will be forced to seize the property." Thomas leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "I'll get you your money. We've heard that before. Then you'll hear it again." The Vex's tail flicked with irritation. "You are a stubborn man, Mr. Verne, but stubbornness does not pay debts." It turned and walked back to its skimmer. Before climbing in, it called over its shoulder, 30 days. After that, this land belongs to the Korath Financial Group. Thomas watched the skimmer disappear, then went back inside and stared at his empty cupboards. He didn't have the money. He never would. That night, he sat at the table with a bottle of water and Lirae's old ledger. He flipped through the pages, looking at the drawings she'd left behind, the spires, the ships, the crowds, a life he couldn't even imagine. "Hope you're doing okay, kid," he said to the empty room. The wind howled outside, and the cabin creaked. And then, 14 years after the soldiers had taken her away, the sky turned silver again. Thomas was asleep when the sound began. It was a deep, resonant hum that rattled the windows and shook the floorboards. He sat up, groggy and confused, and stumbled to the window. The entire sky was filled with ships. Not one ship, not 10, hundreds, maybe thousands. They stretched from horizon to horizon, blotting out the stars. Destroyers the size of cities, frigates bristling with weapons, sleek fighters darting between the larger vessels like schools of fish, and at the center of it all, suspended in orbit like a crown, was a ship so vast it didn't seem real. It was a fortress, a cathedral, a monument to power. Thomas stared, his mouth open, unable to process what he was seeing. And then, as if responding to his gaze, a single ship detached from the fleet and began descending. It landed in his field, its thrusters scorching the Kethwheat black. Thomas walked outside, barefoot and unarmed, and stopped at the edge of the burnt earth. The ramp extended, figures began emerging, dozens of them, all in ornate armor that gleamed like molten gold. They moved with perfect synchronization, forming 2 lines that stretched from the ramp to where Thomas stood. At the end of the lines, a final figure descended. She was tall now, nearly 6 feet, with the same luminous blue skin and silver hair that fell past her shoulders. She wore armor unlike anything Thomas had ever seen, plates of metal that seemed to flow like water, etched with glowing symbols. A crown of light hovered above her head, pulsing softly. Her golden eyes met his. "Hello, Thomas," Empress Lirae Sunari said. Thomas stared at her, at the fleet overhead, at the soldiers kneeling as she passed them, and he said the only thing that came to mind. "You got tall." Lirae smiled. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Thomas stood in his threadbare nightshirt and work pants, barefoot on scorched earth, staring at the woman who had once been a terrified child in clothes too big for her. Lirae stood at the base of the ramp, flanked by soldiers whose armor caught the light of a dozen moons now visible in the night sky, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she stepped forward, and the soldiers moved with her like a living wall of steel. "Thomas Verne," Lirae said, and her voice carried across the field with a resonance that made the air vibrate. It wasn't loud, it was simply present, the way a mountain is present. "I have come to honor a debt 15 years overdue." Thomas blinked. "A debt?" Lirae stopped 5 paces away from him. This close he could see the details of her armor, the way the metal seemed to breathe, the intricate patterns that moved like living things across its surface. The crown above her head pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "You saved my life," she said simply. "You fed me, sheltered me, protected me from beasts and asked nothing in return. You treated me with kindness when I was lost and alone." She paused, and something like pain flickered across her face. "And when my guards came, you let me go without question. You did not bargain. You did not demand reward. You simply let me go." "You were a kid," Thomas said. "What was I supposed to do, keep you prisoner?" One of the soldiers, a tall, four-armed being with crimson skin and eyes like molten silver, shifted slightly. "Your Majesty," it said, its voice a low rumble, "this human speaks out of turn. Shall I—" "You will do nothing, Commander Vectis," Lirae said, not looking away from Thomas. "This man speaks to me as an equal, because I permit it, because he earned it." The soldier went still. Lirae stepped closer. "I never forgot you, Thomas. Not for a single day. I wanted to return sooner, but—" She gestured upward, toward the fleet that filled the sky. "The duties of an empress are vast and unforgiving. There were wars to end, treaties to forge, a dynasty to stabilize. But I never stopped searching for this place. For you." Thomas looked past her, at the hundreds of soldiers standing at attention, at the ship that could have leveled his entire farm with a single weapon. "This is a hell of a way to say thank you." "I am an empress, Thomas. I do not do small gestures." Thomas scratched the back of his head. "Look, I appreciate it, but you didn't have to bring an entire fleet just to—" "I am not here to thank you," Lirae interrupted. Her voice was firm, but there was a warmth beneath it. "I am here to repay you, and to offer you something no one in this empire can refuse." She turned to face the assembled soldiers and raised her hand. The entire formation snapped to even sharper attention. Then Lirae raised her voice, and it carried across the field, across the hills, across the very planet itself. "I, Lirae Sunari, Empress of the 17 Systems, Keeper of the Eternal Flame, Guardian of the Sunari dynasty, do hereby declare Thomas Verne of this world to be named Protector of the Crown, Savior of the Ascendant Line, and Guardian of Honor within the Sunari Empire." The soldiers dropped to one knee in perfect unison. The sound of their armor hitting the ground was like thunder. Thomas stared. "What?" Lirae turned back to him. "You are now under my direct protection. No law in the Empire supersedes your authority save mine. No noble, no warlord, no corporation can touch you. Your land, your life, your freedom, all are guaranteed by imperial decree." She smiled. "You are effectively untouchable." Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't want to be untouchable. I just want to work my farm." "Then work it," Lirae said, "but you will do so as an honored citizen of the Empire, with every resource at your disposal." She gestured, and one of the soldiers approached, carrying a sleek datapad. Lirae took it and handed it to Thomas. "This contains the cancellation of all debts associated with your land. The Korath Financial Group has been informed that any claim they held is now void. The land is yours, free and clear, in perpetuity." Thomas looked down at the datapad. Numbers scrolled across the screen, figures so large they didn't seem real. At the bottom, a single line glowed in gold script. "By order of the Empress. Non-negotiable. I also took the liberty of purchasing the surrounding territories," Lirae continued. "Approximately 50,000 hectares. They are now designated as a protected agricultural zone under Imperial Charter. No corporation can develop them. No government can tax them. They exist solely to support your work." Thomas felt dizzy. 50,000, that's insane." "It is fair," Lirae said. "You gave me sanctuary when I had nothing. I am giving you the same." Thomas looked up at her, at this woman who had once sat at his table eating porridge, like it was the finest meal she'd ever had. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why go through all this trouble for one old farmer?" Lirae's expression softened. "Because you taught me something, Thomas. In those 2 weeks you taught me what true kindness looks like. Not kindness given because of duty or status or expectation, but kindness given simply because someone needed it. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. I rule 17 star systems. Billions of lives depend on my decisions, and every single day when I sit on my throne and make those decisions, I think about the man who fed me porridge and asked nothing in return. You reminded me what it means to be human. Thomas felt something crack inside him. He looked away, blinking hard. I'm not that special. You are to me. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the fleet overhead. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. So what happens now? Now, Lirae said. You come with me. Thomas frowned. What? You are hereby summoned to the imperial capital as an honored guest of the crown. There will be a formal ceremony recognizing your title. Banquets, celebrations. The entire court will know your name. Absolutely not. Lirae blinked. What? No, Thomas said firmly. I don't want banquets. I don't want ceremonies. I don't want a bunch of fancy people I've never met telling me how great I am. I just want to stay here and work my farm. One of the soldiers made a choking sound. Commander Vectis stepped forward. Your Majesty, the human refuses your summons. This is an insult to the throne. He must be respected, Lirae said sharply. She turned back to Thomas. You truly wish to remain here? I do. Lirae studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Very well. I will not force you, but I ask one thing in return. What? Allow me to visit, not as an empress, just as... She hesitated. As Lirae, the girl you once knew. Thomas felt the corner of his mouth twitch. You want to visit my farm? If you'll have me. Thomas looked at her, at the crown, the armor, the fleet overhead, and then he looked past all of it and saw the girl sitting on the porch, watching the stars. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. Lirae's smile was radiant. She turned to her soldiers. Commander Vectis, establish a perimeter around this land. Nothing enters or leaves without my permission. I will be staying here for the next 3 days. Vectis looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Your Majesty, we cannot secure a planetary perimeter with only... Then bring down the fleet. Vectis went pale. The entire fleet. Every ship. I want this world locked down. No one disturbs us. As you command, Vectis said weakly. Lirae dismissed the soldiers with a wave, and they retreated toward the ship, leaving only 2 guards standing at a respectful distance. She turned back to Thomas, and the crown above her head flickered and disappeared. The armor seemed to relax, becoming less imposing. So, she said, do you still have that porridge? Thomas laughed, a short, startled sound. I think I can manage that. They walked together toward the cabin, and as they did, the sky above them began to fill with descending ships. One by one, the fleet came down, blanketing the atmosphere in a web of silver and gold. Entire battle groups took up position in orbit. Destroyers hovered over the hills. Fighters patrolled the clouds. Thomas glanced up. You know, this might be overkill. I take your safety very seriously, Lirae said. I'm starting to notice that. Inside the cabin, Thomas lit the stove and began preparing the porridge exactly the way he had 15 years ago. Lirae sat at the same table, in the same chair, and watched him work with the same quiet intensity. She'd removed her gauntlets, and her hands looked almost delicate in the firelight. It's smaller than I remembered, she said softly. It's the same size, Thomas said. You got bigger. I suppose I did. She looked around the cabin, taking in the worn furniture, the patched roof, the shelves stocked with simple tools and supplies. You kept it the same. Didn't see much reason to change it. The porridge began to bubble. Thomas added honey, stirred it, and ladled it into 2 bowls. He set one in front of Lirae and sat down across from her. So, he said. Empress, huh? Lirae picked up the spoon. It's complicated. I'd imagine. She took a bite, closed her eyes, and smiled. It tastes exactly the same. Porridge doesn't change much. They ate in comfortable silence, and for a moment it felt like no time had passed at all, just a man and a girl sharing a simple meal. But then Lirae set down her spoon and looked at him with those ancient, glowing eyes. Thomas, she said, I need to tell you something about why I was in that forest, about why I was alone. Thomas leaned back in his chair. You don't have to. I do, she said. You deserve to know. And so she told him. She told him about the assassination attempt, how rival factions within the court had tried to kill her and her family during a diplomatic voyage, how the ship had been sabotaged, how they'd crashed on this world, how she'd been separated from her parents in the chaos. She told him about wandering through the forest for days, starving and terrified, until the claw beasts had found her. "My parents sent the guards to find me," she said, "but by the time they located the crash site, I was already here, with you." She looked down at her hands. "They wanted to take me immediately, but I didn't want to leave. Not yet. So I convinced them to give me 2 weeks. To recover. To say goodbye properly." Thomas frowned. "You could have told me." "I was 9 years old, Thomas. I didn't know how." She met his gaze. "And I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you'd treat me differently. That you'd stop being kind and start being careful." Thomas thought about that. "Maybe," he admitted, "but maybe not." "I couldn't take that risk," Lirae said. "Those 2 weeks were the first time in my life anyone treated me like I was just a person, not a princess, not an heir, just Lirae." She smiled sadly. "I wanted to keep that feeling for as long as I could." Thomas reached across the table and patted her hand. "Well, for what it's worth, you're still just Lirae to me. Crown or no crown." Lirae's eyes shimmered. "Thank you." They finished their meal, and afterward Lirae insisted on helping clean the dishes. She did it clumsily, splashing water on the floor and dropping a spoon twice, but she refused to let Thomas do it alone. When they were done, she stood by the window and looked out at the fleet illuminating the night sky. "Tomorrow," she said, "I have to return to the capital. There are things I cannot delay any longer." "I figured. But I will come back, as often as I can. I'll be here." Lirae turned and looked at him, and for a moment she was that lost little girl again, small and frightened and desperately grateful. "Promise?" "Promise," Thomas said, and he meant it. Lirae kept her word. Over the next year, she returned to Thomas's farm 6 times. Each visit lasted 3 days, no more, no less, and each time the sky filled with ships and the ground trembled beneath the weight of an empire's protection. The soldiers never entered the farm itself. They maintained a perimeter 10 kilometers out, turning Thomas's modest property into the most heavily defended piece of land in 17 star systems. Thomas learned to ignore the ships. During Lirae's visits, they fell into an easy routine. She would arrive at dawn, dismiss her attendants, and change out of her imperial regalia into simple clothes Thomas had set aside for her: work pants, canvas shirts, boots that had seen better days. Then they would work the farm together. Lirae was a terrible farmer. She planted seeds too deep, watered crops unevenly, and once accidentally set an entire row of keth wheat on fire when her powers flared during a moment of frustration. But she tried. She worked until her hands blistered and her back ached, and she never once complained. Thomas would watch her struggle with a stubborn irrigation valve or wrestle with a tangled ground vine, and he'd shake his head and wonder how this woman commanded fleets. At night, they would sit on the porch and talk. Lirae told him about the empire, the endless councils, the diplomatic negotiations, the delicate balance of power between noble houses that had been feuding for centuries. She spoke of Admiral Corran, her chief military commander, who wanted to expand the empire's borders through conquest. She spoke of House Veleth, a powerful faction that controlled the mining guilds and resented her reformist policies. She spoke of the weight of the crown, the loneliness of absolute power, and the way every decision she made affected billions of lives she would never meet. Thomas told her about his crops, his debts paid off, and the strange peace he'd found in being left alone. "You know," Lirae said one evening, her feet propped up on the porch railing, "most people would kill for the resources I've given you. Advanced agricultural equipment, automated systems, climate regulators. You could turn this place into the most productive farm in the sector." Thomas sipped his water. "I don't want that." "Why not?" "Because it's not mine anymore if machines do it. I like the work. I like knowing that when I eat bread, it's because I planted the grain, harvested it, ground it, and baked it. It means something." Lirae looked at him for a long moment. "You're a strange man, Thomas Verne." "I've been told," she smiled. "I think that's why I like you." But not everyone shared her sentiment. The first sign of trouble came on Lirae's 7th visit. She arrived as usual, but this time Commander Vectis accompanied her down the ramp. The 4-armed soldier looked uncomfortable, his crimson skin darker than usual, and he kept glancing back at the ship as if expecting reinforcements. "Your Majesty," Vectis said carefully, "I must again voice my objection to these excursions. The court grows restless." Lirae didn't look at him. She was already pulling off her ceremonial cloak and handing it to an attendant. "The court is always restless, Commander. That is their nature. With respect, this is different. There are whispers, Questions about why the Empress spends so much time on an insignificant agricultural world. Some are calling it inappropriate. Thomas, who had been standing by the cabin door, raised an eyebrow. Inappropriate? Vectis's many eyes fixed on him. You are a commoner human, an alien. For the Empress to spend her personal time with you, to grant you titles and protection, to bring the full might of the imperial fleet to guard your land, it raises concerns about favoritism, about judgment. Commander, Lirae said, her voice cold enough to freeze stars, you overstep. Vectis lowered his head but didn't back down. I speak only out of concern for your safety and reputation, Your Majesty. The noble houses talk, and when they talk long enough, they begin to act. Let them, Lirae said. I am the Empress, I do not answer to them. Vectis said nothing, but his expression suggested he disagreed. He bowed stiffly and returned to the ship, leaving Lirae and Thomas alone. Well, Thomas said, that was awkward. Lirae exhaled slowly. He's right, you know. The court doesn't understand this. They see my visits as weakness, as distraction. She looked at Thomas. Some are saying I've been compromised. Compromised how? They think you're manipulating me, that you've used some kind of human trick to gain influence over the throne. Thomas barked out a laugh. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I know, but perception matters in politics. And the perception is that I care more about a farmer on a backwater world than I do about the Empire. Thomas crossed his arms. Do you? Lirae met his gaze. I care about both. But I will not apologize for valuing the person who taught me what compassion looks like. If the court sees that as weakness, then they've already forgotten what it means to rule. She changed into her work clothes and spent the next 3 days on the farm, just as she always did. But Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes occasionally drifted toward the sky, as if expecting something to descend. On the last day of her visit, something did. Thomas was repairing the porch steps when a sleek courier ship broke through the atmosphere, moving fast. It didn't land. It hovered above the farm, its engines thrumming with barely contained power. A holographic projection flickered to life in the air between Thomas and Lirae. The figure in the projection was tall and elegant, with pale green skin and eyes like chips of ice. They wore robes of deep purple trimmed with silver thread, and a circlet rested on their narrow head. When they spoke, their voice was smooth and venomous. Your Majesty, the figure said, inclining their head in a gesture that was more insult than respect. Duke Vorlon Veleth, I apologize for the intrusion, but there are matters of state that require your immediate attention. Lirae's expression didn't change. Duke Vorlon, I was not expecting communication. Nor was I expecting to find our Empress playing farmer on a forgotten world, Vorlon said, their smile thin. But the Council has convened in your absence. Several urgent matters have been raised. Trade disputes, military deployments, the Quran incident. Your presence is required. I will return when my visit concludes, Lirae said, 3 days from now. With respect, Your Majesty, the Council believes this matter cannot wait 3 days. Admiral Corran has mobilized forces without authorization. House Torvin claims territorial violations, and there are other concerns that must be addressed privately. Lirae's jaw tightened. What other concerns? Vorlon's gaze flicked briefly to Thomas, then back to Lirae. Concerns best discussed within the security of the Imperial Palace, Your Majesty. Not in open air, on an unprotected world. This world is protected by the full might of my fleet, Lirae said coldly. Speak plainly, Duke. Vorlon hesitated, and for the first time Thomas saw something like genuine unease cross their face. Very well. There are those within the court who question your priorities, who believe your frequent absences and associations indicate a lack of focus on imperial matters. A petition has been drafted, signed by 12 noble houses, requesting a formal review of your recent decisions. The air seemed to drop 10 degrees. A review, Lirae said softly, of my decisions. As Empress. A formality, of course, Vorlon said quickly. No one questions your authority, but there are procedures, traditions, expectations, and when an Empress spends more time with a human farmer than with her own advisors, people begin to wonder, enough. The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but it carried a weight that made the hologram flicker, and Thomas felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Lirae stepped forward, her golden eyes blazing. You dare speak to me of tradition, Vorlon? You whose house has embezzled fortunes from the mining guilds and blocked every reform I've proposed for the past 5 years. You who sent assassins after my family when I was a child. Vorlon's face went rigid. "Your Majesty, those accusations are—" "True," Lirae said, "and documented. I have been patient with you, Duke. I have tolerated your scheming because I believed you could be reasoned with. But if you think you can threaten me by questioning my associations, you are gravely mistaken." She raised her hand, and golden flame erupted from her palm, not the small, controlled sphere Thomas had seen her practice with, but a roaring column of fire that lit up the entire farm. The hologram flickered violently, and Vorlon flinched. "I am Lirae Sunari," she said, her voice echoing with power. "I am the keeper of the eternal flame. I am the 107th ruler of the Sunari dynasty, and I hold dominion over 17 star systems by right of blood and conquest. I do not require your approval. I do not answer to petitions, and I certainly do not explain myself to you." The flame grew brighter, hotter. "Thomas Verne saved my life when I was a child. He showed me kindness when I had nothing. He asked for no reward, no title, no power. He simply helped because it was the right thing to do. That is why I honor him. That is why I protect him. And if you or anyone else in the court takes issue with that, you are welcome to challenge me directly." The flame vanished, leaving only scorched earth. Vorlon stared at her, pale and trembling. "Your Majesty, I—" "Return to the capital," Lirae said. "Tell the council I will address their concerns when I choose to, not when they demand it. And tell them this: the next person who questions my judgment will find themselves stripped of rank and exiled to the outer rim. Am I clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Majesty." The hologram cut out. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well, that escalated." Lirae turned to him, and the fire in her eyes slowly dimmed. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Don't be. That was the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed." Despite everything, Lirae smiled. But it didn't reach her eyes. "They're not wrong, you know. I have been neglecting the court, spending too much time here, too much time away from my duties. So, stop coming," Thomas said. Lirae looked at him sharply. "What?" "Stop coming here. If it's causing you this much trouble, just stop. I'll be fine." Lirae shook her head. "You don't understand. These visits, they're the only time I get to be myself. The only time I'm not performing or negotiating or pretending to tolerate people who despise me. You're the only person in the entire empire who doesn't want something from me." Thomas walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Lirae, I'll always be your friend, but I'm not worth starting a civil war over." "You're worth more than you know," Lirae said quietly. She looked out at the farm, at the fields they'd worked together, at the cabin that had become her sanctuary. "But you're right. I can't keep running away. I have responsibilities." "Then go handle them," Thomas said. "And when things calm down, you come back. I'll still be here." Lirae nodded slowly. "I'll return in 1 month, no sooner, and I'll deal with the court properly." "Good." She changed back into her imperial regalia, the armor flowing over her like liquid metal, the crown materializing above her head. When she looked at him again, she was no longer Lirae the girl. She was Lirae the Empress. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, "for everything." "Any time, kid." She smiled at that, then turned and walked toward her ship. The soldiers fell in line behind her, and the ramp closed. The vessel lifted into the sky, followed by the rest of the fleet, until the sky was clear once more. Thomas stood in the middle of his farm, watching them go, and wondered how long it would be before the storm truly broke. He didn't have to wonder long. 2 weeks later, the assassins came. Thomas knew something was wrong the moment he stepped outside. The morning was too quiet. No wind, no bird calls. Even the usual hum of insects had fallen silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He stood on the porch, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, and scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. The fields stretched out in their usual rows, the kethwheat swaying gently despite the lack of breeze. The sky was clear, pale blue fading into gold as the sun climbed. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. Thomas set down his coffee and walked to the shed, where he kept his tools. He grabbed the machete, the same one he'd used to fight the claw beasts 15 years ago, and started toward the north field. His knee protested, as it always did in the mornings, but he ignored it. He made it 50 meters before he saw the first body. It was lying face down in the dirt, partially hidden by a row of crops. Thomas approached carefully, machete raised, and nudged it with his boot. The figure didn't move. He crouched down and rolled it over. It was an alien, sleek, reptilian, with mottled grey-green skin and slitted yellow eyes that stared sightlessly at the sky. It wore form-fitting black armor, the kind designed for stealth rather than protection, and a wicked, curved blade was still clutched in its clawed hand. A burn mark the size of Thomas's fist had been seared through its chest, right where its heart would be. Thomas stood slowly, his pulse quickening. He found the second body 30 meters away, slumped against a fence post. Same species, same armor, same burn wound. The third was in the irrigation ditch, half submerged in shallow water. The fourth was near the cabin, collapsed in a twisted heap, all dead, all killed the same way. Precise, efficient, overwhelming force. Thomas's hands tightened on the machete. Someone had sent assassins, and someone else had stopped them. "You can come out now," Thomas called, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I know you're there." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shimmered and a figure materialized 10 paces away. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, and covered head to toe in armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The design was unlike anything Thomas had seen before, sleek, organic, with no visible seams or joints. A helmet obscured its face, smooth and featureless, except for 2 glowing blue lenses where eyes should be. The figure stood perfectly still, hands empty, posture non-threatening. Thomas kept the machete raised. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached up and touched the side of its helmet. The metal retracted with a soft hiss, revealing the face beneath. Thomas blinked. It was a woman, or at least something close to it. Her skin was a deep burnished bronze, and her eyes were an unsettling silver with no pupils or whites. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, jet black with streaks of white at the temples. She looked human mostly, but there was something off about her proportions. Her limbs too long, her features too sharp. "My name is Kaelin," she said. Her voice was low and precise, each word carefully measured. "I am a shadow guard, sworn to the protection of Empress Lirae Sunari. I have been assigned to watch over you." Thomas stared. "Watch over me?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Since the Empress's first departure from this world, 15 years. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You've been here the whole time?" "Yes." "Watching me?" "Yes." Thomas lowered the machete slowly. "Why?" Kaelin tilted her head slightly, as if the question confused her. "Because the Empress commanded it. You saved her life. You are under her protection. It is my duty to ensure no harm comes to you." But she never said anything. She did not want you to feel monitored. Kaelin's expression didn't change, but something in her tone suggested discomfort. "The Empress believed you would object to constant surveillance. She ordered me to remain undetected unless your life was in immediate danger." Thomas looked around at the dead assassins scattered across his farm. "And tonight qualified?" "These are agents of House Veleth," Kaelin said. "They were sent to eliminate you as a message to the Empress. Had they succeeded, it would have destabilized her rule and emboldened her enemies." She paused. "I could not allow that." Thomas rubbed his face with his free hand. "So you've been here for 15 years. Just watching?" "Yes." "Where?" Kaelin gestured toward the blackwood thicket. "I maintain a perimeter within the forest. I observe from a distance. I do not interfere unless necessary." Thomas thought about all the times he'd worked the fields alone, all the nights he'd sat on the porch thinking he was the only person for kilometers. "That's unsettling." "It is necessary." "Does Lirae know you're revealing yourself now?" "She does not, but circumstances have changed. The assassination attempt confirms what intelligence has suspected. The noble houses are moving against her. They see you as a vulnerability, as leverage." Kaelin stepped closer, her silver eyes fixed on Thomas. "You are in danger, Thomas Verne, and by extension so is the Empress." Thomas set the machete down on the fence post and sat heavily on the porch steps. "What do you want me to do?" "Leave this world," Kaelin said immediately. "Come to the capital. Accept the Empress's protection in a secure location where we can defend you properly." "No." "You would refuse?" "This is my home," Thomas said. "I'm not running because some nobles are throwing a tantrum." Kaelin's expression tightened, just slightly but enough to show frustration. "You do not understand the forces arrayed against you. House Veleth commands considerable resources. This was only the first attempt. There will be others. Then stop them like you stopped this one. I am one operative. I cannot defend you against a sustained assault." "Then bring more guards." "The Empress cannot deploy imperial forces to protect a single civilian without raising questions. It would confirm the court's suspicions that she has been compromised." Thomas looked up at her. "So what you're saying is, if I stay here, I'm a target, and if Lirae sends help it makes her look weak." "Precisely." Thomas laughed. A short, bitter sound. Hell of a situation. Kalen said nothing. Thomas stood and looked out at his fields, at the farm he'd built with Helen, at the land that had been his entire life. Then he looked at the dead assassins and thought about Lirae, the girl who'd sat at his table, the woman who'd become an empress, the friend who'd honored him beyond anything he deserved. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll go." Kalen's eyes widened, just slightly. "You will?" "On one condition." "Name it." "You tell me everything. Who's coming after me, why, and what it means for Lirae. No secrets, no half-truths. If I'm walking into a war, I want to know whose war it is." Kalen studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Agreed." They buried the assassins in the blackwood thicket, far enough from the farm that no one would stumble across them. Kalen worked with mechanical efficiency, her armor shifting to deploy tools Thomas didn't recognize. He helped as best he could, though his aging back protested every shovelful of dirt. When it was done, they returned to the cabin. Kalen stood by the door, her armor seamless once more, while Thomas packed a small bag. He didn't own much. A few changes of clothes, some tools, Lirae's old ledger with her drawings. He looked around the cabin one last time, at the worn furniture and patched walls, and wondered if he'd ever see it again. "Ready?" Kalen asked. "No," Thomas said, "but let's go anyway." Kalen touched a device on her wrist, and the air above the farm shimmered. A ship uncloaked, sleek, black, and utterly silent. It descended until it hovered just above the ground, a ramp extending from its belly. Thomas climbed aboard, and the ramp sealed behind him. The interior was sparse, utilitarian seating, exposed conduits, banks of equipment he didn't understand. Kalen took the pilot's seat and began working the controls. The ship lifted smoothly, without even a tremor, and the farm fell away beneath them. Thomas watched through a viewport as his land shrank to a speck, then disappeared entirely as they broke through the atmosphere. "Tell me," he said. "Start from the beginning." Kalen didn't take her eyes off the controls. The Sunari dynasty has ruled for 3,000 years. It is ancient, powerful, and deeply flawed. The current structure gives considerable autonomy to the noble houses, families who control entire systems and wield their own military forces. The Empress rules by consent as much as by authority. Sounds unstable. It is. When Empress Lirae ascended to the throne, she was young, idealistic, and determined to reform the empire. She implemented policies to reduce corruption, redistribute wealth, and curb the power of the noble houses. This made her many enemies. Let me guess. House Veleth was at the top of that list. Among others, Duke Vorlon Veleth controls the mining guilds and profits enormously from exploiting outer worlds. The Empress's reforms threaten his wealth and influence. He has spent years building a coalition of like-minded houses, all of whom benefit from the current system and resent change, so they want her gone. Not necessarily. A direct coup would be too risky. The Empress commands the loyalty of the imperial military and retains support among the common people. But if they can destabilize her, make her appear weak or unfit to rule, they can force her to abdicate or push through a council that limits her power. Thomas frowned. And killing me accomplishes that how? You are her vulnerability, Kalen said. The court knows she cares for you. If you die, she will be devastated, distracted. Her enemies can exploit that moment of weakness. Alternatively, if she overreacts, if she deploys the full might of the fleet to avenge you, they can paint her as irrational and consumed by personal vendetta. Either way, they win. Thomas leaned back in his seat. So I'm bait. You are a strategic asset, which is why we must ensure your safety. The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, and the stars outside stretched into lines of light. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to process everything he'd just heard. Does Lirae know? He asked. About the plot? She suspects, but she does not have proof. House Veleth is careful. Then we find proof. Kalen glanced at him. That is not your responsibility. It is now. They traveled for 6 hours, jumping through 3 different systems before finally approaching the capital. Thomas had seen images of it before, brief flashes on news feeds, historical archives, but nothing prepared him for the reality. The imperial seat was not a planet. It was a construct, an artificial world built over millennia, a sphere of interlocking stations, habitats and docking platforms that orbited a dying star. Entire cities floated in the void, connected by transparent transit tubes that looked like veins of light. Warships the size of mountains hung in formation around the structure, their weapons bristling like thorns. And at the heart of it all, suspended in a lattice of gravitational anchors, was the palace. It was a castle in space, impossible towers of crystal and metal that caught the light of the dying star and refracted it into 1,000 colors. Gardens hung in zero gravity, trees growing in spirals, water flowing in impossible directions. The whole thing defied physics and reason, a monument to power so absolute it could reshape reality. Thomas stared. Good God! The Eternal Throne, Kalen said, home of the Sunari dynasty. Their ship was cleared for landing immediately. Apparently, a Shadow Guard's credentials opened all doors. They descended through layers of security fields, past patrol ships and automated defenses, until finally settling on a private landing platform high above the palace's main structure. The ramp opened, and Thomas stepped out into a world of light and sound. The platform overlooked a plaza filled with thousands of beings, humans, aliens of a dozen species, all moving through the space in choreographed chaos. Music drifted up from below, along with the smell of food and the hum of conversation. Above, the stars themselves seemed close enough to touch. Kalen led him through a series of corridors, each more opulent than the last. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting ancient battles, the floors inlaid with precious metals, the ceilings impossibly high. Everywhere he looked, people bowed as Kalen passed, some in respect, some in fear. Finally, they reached a set of massive doors guarded by 4 soldiers in golden armor. The Empress is inside, Kalen said. She does not yet know you are here. I will announce you. Thomas nodded, his mouth dry. The doors opened, and he stepped into the throne room. It was vast, easily the size of a starship hangar, with columns of crystal rising toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. At the far end, elevated on a dais of white stone, sat the throne itself, a masterpiece of carved metal and living flame, its back formed from golden fire that burned without heat. And on that throne sat Lirae. She wore armor of silver and gold, her crown a halo of light, her expression stern and regal as she addressed a cluster of robed figures kneeling before her. Her voice echoed through the hall, sharp and commanding. Then her eyes found Thomas. She stopped mid-sentence. The robed figures turned to look, confusion rippling through the room. Lirae stood, her armor making no sound, and descended the dais. She walked across the throne room, ignoring the murmurs of the court, and stopped directly in front of Thomas. You came, she said. Didn't have much choice, Thomas replied. Lirae looked at Kalen. Explain. House Veleth sent assassins, Your Majesty. 4 operatives. I eliminated them, but the threat remains. I determined extraction was necessary. Lirae's expression didn't change, but her hands clenched into fists. Veleth, we suspected, Kalen said. Now we know. Lirae turned back to Thomas. I am sorry, I never wanted you dragged into this. I know, Thomas said, but I'm here now. So let's figure out what happens next. Lirae smiled, small, tired, but genuine. Yes, let's. She turned back to the court, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. This session is concluded. All petitioners are dismissed. Commander Vectis, assemble my council in the war room. We have much to discuss. The robed figures bowed and filed out, casting curious glances at Thomas as they passed. Within moments, the throne room was empty, except for Lirae, Thomas, Kalen, and the silent guards. Lirae let out a long breath and sank down onto the steps of the dais. Welcome to the capital, Thomas. I hope you survive it. Thomas sat beside her. Me too. The war room was not what Thomas expected. He'd imagined something grand, holographic displays, rows of uniformed officers, walls lined with weapons and battle standards. Instead, he found himself in a circular chamber barely 20 meters across, its walls made of polished black stone that absorbed light. A single round table dominated the center, surrounded by 12 chairs. Above it, a hovering sphere of light cast just enough illumination to see by. Intimate, private, designed for secrets. Lirae entered first, her armor shifting as she moved, becoming less ornate, more functional. The crown above her head dimmed to a faint glow. Commander Vectis followed, his 4 arms crossed in what Thomas was learning to recognize as unease. Kalen took up position by the door, silent and watchful. Then 3 more figures entered. The first was an elderly woman, human, surprisingly, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She wore simple robes of deep blue, and when she moved, it was with the careful precision of someone who'd lived too long to waste motion. Chancellor Mira, Lirae said. My chief advisor. The woman nodded to Thomas without warmth. Mr. Verne. Your reputation precedes you. The second figure was massive, nearly 8 feet tall, covered in thick, grey-scaled hide that looked like living stone. Its head was broad and flat, with small, intelligent eyes and a mouth full of blunt teeth. It wore no armor, no decoration, only a single bronze medallion around its thick neck. "Admiral Thane Corran," Lirae said, "commander of the Second Fleet." The creature's voice was like grinding boulders. "The farmer, I have heard much." The third figure made Thomas's skin crawl. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Its skin was translucent, showing the dark fluid that flowed through its veins. Its eyes were pure black, without iris or pupil, and when it moved, it seemed to glide rather than walk. It wore robes of dark red, and its fingers were too long, ending in sharp points. "Inquisitor Savren," Lirae said, her voice neutral, "head of Imperial Intelligence." Savren smiled, and Thomas immediately wished it hadn't. "Mr. Verne, how delightful to finally meet the man who has captured our Empress's affection." "Everyone sit," Lirae commanded. They did, arranging themselves around the table. Thomas found himself between Kaelin and Chancellor Mira, directly across from Lirae. The sphere of light above them brightened slightly, and suddenly the air was filled with translucent displays, maps, reports, data streams that scrolled too fast for Thomas to read. "We have a problem," Lirae began. "House Veleth has moved from political maneuvering to assassination. They sent 4 operatives to kill Thomas Verne on his homeworld. Kaelin intercepted and eliminated them, but the message is clear: they are willing to escalate." Admiral Corran leaned forward. "With respect, Your Majesty, this is not unexpected. Veleth has been positioning for months. The question is not whether they will act, but when. And how," Chancellor Mira added. "An assassination attempt on a protected citizen is bold, reckless. It suggests desperation." Inquisitor Savren's black eyes fixed on Thomas. "Or confidence. They believe they can strike without consequence." Thomas met the gaze and refused to look away. "What's stopping you from just arresting them?" "Evidence," Lirae said, "or rather the lack of it. The assassins carried no identification. Their equipment was unregistered. Even their genetic profiles were scrubbed. We know they came from Veleth, but we cannot prove it." "Then find proof," Thomas said. "We are trying," Savren said smoothly, "but House Veleth is careful. They have spent centuries perfecting the art of plausible deniability." Commander Vectis shifted in his seat. "There is another consideration, Your Majesty. If we move against Veleth without irrefutable evidence, other houses will see it as tyranny. They will rally to Veleth's defense not because they support him, but because they fear being targeted themselves." "So we do nothing?" Thomas asked. "We do what we can," Lirae said. "We tighten security. We gather intelligence. We prepare for their next move. And in the meantime, I'm locked in a palace." Lirae looked at him, and for a moment the Empress faded, and he saw the girl again, tired, frustrated, and carrying a weight no one else could share. "I cannot lose you, Thomas, not to them, not like this." Thomas wanted to argue, to tell her he could take care of himself, but the words died in his throat. He'd seen what happened to the assassins. He'd seen the casual efficiency with which Kaelin had ended them. This wasn't his world. These weren't his rules. "All right," he said quietly. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay close," Lirae said. "Stay safe. Let me handle the court." Admiral Corran's gravelly voice cut through the tension. "Your Majesty, there is another matter. The Second Fleet has completed its patrol of the outer systems. I request permission to redeploy along the Veleth border as a show of strength." "Denied," Lirae said immediately. Corran's eyes narrowed. "Your Majesty, denied. Deploying the fleet would be seen as an act of aggression. It would give Veleth exactly the excuse they need to claim I am overreaching. Then what would you have me do? Wait for them to strike again?" "I would have you trust my judgment," Lirae said, her voice cold. "Is that too much to ask, Admiral?" The room fell silent. Corran stared at her for a long moment, then bowed his head. "As you command, Your Majesty." But Thomas saw the resentment in his eyes. The meeting continued for another hour. Discussions of supply lines, intelligence reports, political alliances. Thomas understood maybe half of it. The rest was a blur of names, numbers, and strategies that belonged to a world he'd never been part of. Finally, Lirae dismissed them. The advisors filed out, leaving only Thomas, Kaelin, and the Empress. Lirae slumped in her chair, the crown above her head flickering. "I'm losing them," she said quietly. "Who?" Thomas asked. "All of them." Corran barely hides his contempt. "Mira thinks I'm being irrational. Savren is loyal only to power, not to me. The only one I truly trust is Kaelin, and she doesn't speak unless ordered." Lirae laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "I rule 17 star systems, and I have never felt more alone." Thomas stood and walked around the table. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "You're not alone. I brought you here because I was selfish," Lirae said. "Because I needed someone who sees me as a person, not a symbol. But I put you in danger to ease my own loneliness." "What kind of empress does that?" "The kind who's still human," Thomas said. "You made a choice, Lirae. Maybe it wasn't the smartest choice. Maybe it put me at risk, but you did it because you care. That's not weakness. That's the only thing keeping you from becoming like them." Lirae looked at him, her golden eyes shimmering. "You always know what to say." "I really don't," Thomas said. "I'm making this up as I go." She smiled. "Then you're doing better than most." Kaelin cleared her throat softly. "Your Majesty, I should escort Mr. Verne to his quarters. He needs rest." Lirae nodded. "Kaelin will stay with you. She'll be your personal guard." "I don't need—" "You do," Lirae said firmly. "Please, Thomas, let me do this one thing." Thomas sighed. "Fine, but she better not hover." Kaelin's expression didn't change, but Thomas thought he detected the faintest hint of amusement in her silver eyes. Thomas's quarters were lavish by any standard. 3 rooms with ceilings 20 feet high, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, windows that overlooked the sprawling cityscape below. A bed large enough to sleep 6 people dominated the main chamber, draped in silks he was afraid to touch. He dropped his bag by the door and looked around. "This is ridiculous." "This is standard guest accommodation," Kaelin said, taking up position by the entrance. "You should see the royal suites." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. It was too soft. He missed his lumpy mattress back on the farm. "How long do I have to stay here?" "Until the threat is neutralized." "How long will that take?" "Unknown." Thomas rubbed his face. "Great." Kaelin watched him for a moment. "You are handling this better than most would." "I'm terrified," Thomas admitted. "I just don't see the point in showing it." "That is wisdom." Thomas looked up at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you reveal yourself? You could have just stopped the assassins and stayed hidden. Why break cover now?" Kaelin was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Because the Empress needs allies, real ones. And you are the only person in this entire empire who does not serve her out of obligation or fear. You serve her because you choose to. That makes you valuable. That makes you dangerous to her enemies." She paused. "And it makes you worth protecting." Thomas nodded slowly. "Thank you for saving my life. It is my duty. Still, thank you." Kaelin inclined her head slightly. "Rest, Mr. Verne. Tomorrow will be difficult." She wasn't wrong. The next morning, Thomas was awakened by the sound of shouting. He stumbled out of bed, still in his clothes from the day before, and found Kaelin standing by the door with her hand on her weapon. "What's happening?" Thomas asked. "A commotion in the main hall," Kaelin said. "Stay here." "Not a chance." Before she could argue, Thomas pushed past her and into the corridor. The shouting was louder now, echoing through the palace. He followed the sound, Kaelin trailing behind him until he reached a balcony overlooking the throne room. Below, chaos. The hall was packed with nobles in elaborate robes, all shouting at once. At the center of it all, standing on the dais with her fists clenched, was Lirae. Commander Vectis stood beside her, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. And at the front of the crowd, his green skin pale with fury, was Duke Vorlon Veleth. "You accuse me without evidence," Vorlon shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "You slander my house based on rumor and paranoia." "4 assassins attacked under my protection," Lirae said, her voice cold. "They bore Veleth markings. They used Veleth weapons. Deny it if you can." "I deny nothing because there is nothing to deny," Vorlon spread his arms. "Your Majesty, I am a loyal servant of the Empire. If assassins acted in my name, they did so without my knowledge or consent. Punish them by all means, but do not punish me for the crimes of rogues." The crowd murmured, some in agreement. Thomas leaned over the railing. "He's lying." Kaelin placed a hand on his shoulder. "He is. But he is doing it well." Below, Lirae stepped forward, golden flame flickering at her fingertips. "Then you will submit to an inquiry. You will open your records, your communications, your facilities. If you are innocent, you have nothing to hide." Vorlon smiled, thin and cruel. "And if I refuse? Then you will be arrested for treason." The room exploded. Nobles shouted over each other, some supporting the Empress, others condemning her overreach. Vorlon stood in the center of it all, calm and confident, and Thomas realized with a sinking feeling that the Duke had already won. He'd turned this into a spectacle, a public confrontation, and no matter what Lirae did now, it would be seen as tyranny or weakness. Thomas didn't think. He acted. He vaulted over the railing. Kaelin shouted, but it was too late. Thomas dropped 15 feet and landed hard, his knee buckling. He stumbled, caught himself, and walked straight into the center of the throne room. The shouting stopped. Every eye in the hall turned to him. Thomas looked at Vorlon. "You sent people to kill me." Vorlon's expression didn't change. "I have no idea who you are. I'm the man your assassins tried to murder 2 nights ago. I'm the man the Empress honored. And I'm the man standing here telling you you're a liar." The hall erupted again, but Thomas ignored it. He stepped closer to Vorlon, close enough to see the flicker of anger in his ice-chip eyes. "You think I'm scared of you?" Thomas said quietly. "You think because you're some fancy noble with money and power, I'm going to back down? I'm a farmer. I've spent my entire life working land that doesn't want to grow anything. I've buried a wife, fought off predators, and survived on scraps. You don't scare me." Vorlon's smile faded. "You are out of your depth, human." "Maybe," Thomas said. "But I'm still standing, and I'm still here. So if you want me gone, you're going to have to do better than 4 assassins." The silence was absolute. Then Lirae's voice cut through it, sharp and clear. "Thomas Verne speaks with my authority. Any who doubt him, doubt me." She descended the dais and stood beside Thomas, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Hear me, all of you," Lirae said, her voice echoing through the hall. "I have tolerated scheming. I have tolerated disrespect. I have tolerated challenges to my rule because I believed in consensus. But if you threaten those under my protection, if you strike at the innocent to wound me, I will burn your houses to ash and scatter your names to the void." The golden flame erupted from her hands, filling the hall with light. "This is your warning. There will not be another." The nobles backed away, fear written across their faces. Duke Vorlon stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he bowed, stiffly, mockingly, and turned to leave. But as he passed Thomas, he leaned in close and whispered, "You just made this personal." Then he was gone, and the hall emptied, leaving only Thomas, Lirae, Kaelin, and the silent guards. Lirae turned to Thomas, and her expression was a mix of anger and awe. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I have ever seen." Thomas shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing to do. You could have been killed. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried." Lirae laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. Then she pulled him into a hug, her armor cold against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Any time, kid." But as they stood there, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. The attack came 3 days later. Thomas was in the palace gardens, a sprawling complex of terraces and suspended platforms where plants from 100 worlds grew in impossible harmony. He'd needed air, space, somewhere that didn't feel like a gilded cage. Kaelin shadowed him, as always, but kept her distance. He was examining a tree with silver bark and leaves that chimed like bells when the first explosion shook the palace. The sound was distant but unmistakable, a deep, concussive boom that rattled the crystal spires and sent flocks of alien birds screaming into the sky. Thomas spun around just as Kaelin's armor sealed over her face. "We're under attack," she said, her voice distorted by the helmet. "Come now." She grabbed his arm and hauled him toward the nearest transit tube. Behind them, more explosions lit up the sky, bright flashes of weapons fire that carved through defensive shields like they were made of paper. Alarms began wailing, a bone-deep sound that made Thomas's teeth ache. "Who?" Thomas shouted over the noise. "Unknown. Multiple capital ships. They bypassed the outer defenses." Kaelin shoved him into the tube, and they shot downward, the transparent walls showing the chaos unfolding above. Ships, massive angular vessels painted in deep purple, were descending through the atmosphere, their weapons blazing. Fighters swarmed like insects, engaging the palace's defensive platforms. Thomas saw one platform explode, debris raining down onto the city below. "Velith," Kaelin said. "It has to be." They reached the lower levels and burst out into a corridor filled with running soldiers. Kaelin pulled Thomas against the wall as a squad of guards rushed past, their armor glowing with activation runes. An officer stopped when he saw them. "Shadow Guard, what are your orders?" "Secure the Empress," Kaelin said. "I'm taking the Protectorate to the safe room. The Empress is in the throne room. She's refusing to evacuate." Kaelin swore, something harsh and guttural in a language Thomas didn't recognize. "Of course she is." She looked at Thomas. Stay here. Do not move. What are you? But she was already gone, disappearing into the chaos. Thomas pressed himself against the wall as another explosion rocked the palace. Dust rained from the ceiling. The lights flickered. He could hear shouting, weapons fire, the screech of metal being torn apart. Then he heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from the corridor to his right. Thomas turned and saw Duke Vorlon Veleth walking toward him, flanked by 4 armored soldiers. The Duke's expression was calm, almost pleasant, as if he were taking a stroll through a garden rather than walking through a battlefield. "Mr. Verne," Vorlon said. "How fortunate. I was hoping we'd have a chance to speak privately." Thomas looked around. The corridor was empty. Everyone else had fled or was fighting elsewhere. He was alone. "Come to finish the job yourself?" Thomas asked. Vorlon smiled. "Finish? Oh no. I'm here to make you an offer. Not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." Vorlon stopped a few paces away, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are a liability to the Empress, Mr. Verne, a weakness she cannot afford, but you are also an opportunity. I am willing to let you live, to let you return to your little farm unharmed and unmolested, if you simply walk away." "Walk away from what?" "From her, from this palace, from the Empire. Go back to your fields and forget you were ever here. In return, I will ensure no harm comes to you or your land. You have my word." Thomas stared at him. "Your word? The word of a man who just launched an attack on the capital." "A necessary action," Vorlon said smoothly. "The Empress has grown unstable. She prioritizes her personal attachments over the needs of the Empire. She must be removed for the good of all. But you are just a man, a farmer. You do not deserve to die for her mistakes. And if I refuse?" Vorlon's smile faded. "Then you will die here, along with everyone else who stands with her. My forces have already breached the inner defenses. The throne room will fall within the hour. The Empress will be captured or killed. And you will simply be collateral damage, a footnote in a very long day." Thomas felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He thought about Lirae, the girl who'd eaten porridge at his table, the woman who'd honored him beyond reason, the friend who'd trusted him with the weight of her crown. "You're wrong about her," Thomas said quietly. Vorlon tilted his head. "Am I? She's not weak. She's not unstable. She's the only one of you who still remembers what it means to care about people. Not systems, not houses, not power. People. That's why you're afraid of her." Vorlon's expression hardened. "I am not afraid of a child playing at leadership. Then why go through all this trouble?" Thomas gestured at the chaos around them. "Why launch a coup if she's so irrelevant? Why try to kill a nobody farmer if he doesn't matter? You're afraid because she's changing things, because people are starting to believe in her, and if she succeeds, your whole rotten system falls apart." Vorlon stared at him, and for the first time, Thomas saw real anger in his eyes. "You are a fool," Vorlon said. "And you will die a fool's death." He turned to his guards. "Kill him." The soldiers raised their weapons. Thomas closed his eyes, and then golden fire filled the corridor. The soldiers screamed, brief, cut-off sounds, and Thomas opened his eyes to see them collapsing, their armor melting, their bodies consumed by flames that burned too bright to look at directly. Lirae stood at the end of the corridor, her armor blazing with light, her crown a halo of fire. Her eyes were molten gold, and when she spoke, her voice echoed with power that made the walls tremble. "You dare!" Vorlon stumbled backward, his calm facade cracking. "Your Majesty, You dare attack my home. You dare threaten my people. You dare raise your hand against the one I have sworn to protect." The flames grew hotter, brighter. Thomas could feel the heat from 20 paces away. "I am Lirae Sunari," she said, stepping forward. "I am the keeper of the eternal flame. I am the 107th Empress of this dynasty, and I have had enough." She raised her hand, and Vorlon was lifted off his feet, held aloft by invisible force. He gasped, clawing at his throat, his eyes wide with terror. "You wanted to see weakness," Lirae said. "You wanted to believe I was soft, compromised, human." She clenched her fist, and Vorlon screamed. "But I am not human. I am fire made flesh. I am the storm you unleashed, and I will burn you from existence." "Lirae," Thomas said. She didn't hear him. "Lirae," Thomas shouted. She turned, and for a moment he saw something terrifying in her eyes, something ancient and inhuman, a rage that could consume worlds. "Don't," Thomas said. "Please. He tried to kill you. I know, but if you kill him now like this, you become what he says you are, a tyrant, someone who rules through fear." Thomas stepped closer, ignoring the heat. You're better than this. Better than him. Lirae stared at him, the flames flickering. Then slowly she lowered her hand. Vorlon collapsed to the ground, gasping and sobbing. You are right, Lirae said, her voice returning to normal. I am better. She looked down at Vorlon with contempt. Duke Vorlon Velith, you are hereby stripped of rank and title. Your house is dissolved. Your assets are forfeit to the crown. You will be tried for treason, and if found guilty you will spend the rest of your life in confinement on the Outer Rim. But you will live, because I am not the monster you think I am. She turned to the soldiers rushing into the corridor. Take him, and summon Admiral Koran. Tell him to end this. The soldiers hauled Vorlon away, and Lirae finally let the flames die. She swayed on her feet, and Thomas caught her before she fell. Easy, he said. I've got you. Lirae leaned against him, exhausted. I almost lost myself, but you didn't. Because of you. Thomas helped her to a bench against the wall. What happens now? Now we clean up. Lirae closed her eyes. Velith's forces will surrender once they learn he's been captured. The other houses will fall in line, and the Empire will remember why they do not challenge the Sunari dynasty. And me? Lirae opened her eyes and looked at him. You go home, Thomas. Back to your farm, where you belong. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. You sure? I'm sure. She smiled sadly. You were right, back in that corridor. I am better than this. But I can only be better if I let you go, if I stop using you as an anchor and learn to stand on my own. You already stand on your own, kid. You don't need me. I do, Lirae said, but not the way I thought. I need you to remind me what kindness looks like, what compassion means. And I can do that whether you're here or 100 light years away. She took his hand. Go home, Thomas, live your life, and know that whenever I make a decision, whenever I sit on that throne and choose what kind of ruler I want to be, I'll think of the man who fed me porridge and asked nothing in return. Thomas squeezed her hand. You're going to be a hell of an empress. I hope so. They sat together in the ruined corridor, surrounded by the aftermath of battle, and for a little while longer they were just Thomas and Lirae, a farmer and a girl who'd found each other in a forest 15 years ago. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood on the porch of his cabin watching the sun set over his fields. The Keth wheat was coming in strong this year, the best harvest he'd had in a decade. The new irrigation system Lirae had insisted on installing was working perfectly. The fences were mended, the roof was patched, everything was exactly as it should be. He was alone. Kaelin had returned to the capital with Lirae. The fleet was gone. The ships, the soldiers, the chaos, all of it had vanished like a dream, but not entirely. On the table inside, next to Lirae's old ledger, sat a small crystal. It glowed faintly, pulsing with inner light. Lirae had given it to him before he left. If you ever need me, she'd said, just hold it and speak my name. I'll come. No matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, I'll come. Thomas picked up the crystal now and turned it over in his hands. It was warm, almost alive. He set it down and smiled. Take care of yourself, kid, he said to the empty room. And somewhere, 17 star systems away, Empress Lirae Sunari sat on her throne and smiled too. Years passed. Thomas worked his farm. The crops grew. The land flourished. He aged, his hair turning grey, his hands growing more gnarled, but he never stopped working. Lirae visited twice more, once on the anniversary of their first meeting, once when she needed to escape the weight of the crown for a few days. They worked the fields together, ate simple meals and talked about everything and nothing, but mostly they lived their separate lives. Thomas in his cabin, Lirae in her palace, and that was enough. On the day Thomas Verne died, he was 83 years old. He'd been working the North Field, checking on a new crop of seedlings, when his heart simply stopped. He didn't suffer. He didn't struggle. He just sat down in the dirt, looked up at the clear blue sky and let go. Kaelin found him 2 hours later. She'd been monitoring from the forest, as always, and had come running when his vital signs flatlined. But by the time she reached him, it was already over. She held the crystal in her hands and spoke the Empress's name. Lirae arrived within the hour. She landed her ship in the field where Thomas had once saved her life, and she walked through the crops he'd planted, and she knelt beside the body of the man who'd taught her what it meant to be human. She didn't cry. Empresses don't cry in public. But she held his hand, and she whispered words in the ancient tongue of her people, a prayer for the honored dead, a blessing for those who have earned their rest. They buried Thomas Verne on his farm, beneath the tree where Lirae had once sat as a child, watching the stars. A simple grave, a simple marker, his name, his dates, and one line: he was kind. Lirae stood at the grave for a long time, flanked by Kalen and Commander Vectis and a dozen honor guards. The entire Imperial fleet hung in orbit above, their running lights dimmed in mourning. He would have hated this, Lirae said quietly. Yes, Kalen agreed, but he would have understood. Lirae placed her hand on the grave marker, and golden light pulsed through the stone, sealing it for eternity. Thank you, Thomas, she said, for everything. Then she turned and walked back to her ship. The Empire would endure, the dynasty would continue. Wars would be fought, treaties signed, systems conquered and lost. But in a small cabin on a forgotten world, in fields that grew strong and green, the memory of a farmer who'd saved a lost child would live on. And that, more than any crown or title or fleet, was the legacy that mattered.